So, welcome. We discussed last week. We discussed last week the concept that that we cannot. We're on. There's nothing that is hidden from God. By God creating this world, there is absolutely no change in godliness. Nothing. Unlike God is not affected. God is not affected by us, period. God is not affected by anything in creation. And God's knowledge is different than our knowledge. With a human being, the knowledge is a composite. With God, it's not a composite. God knows everything because he knows everything. And it's not there is nothing new that's going to be added to his knowledge. So therefore, because of that, there is no there is nothing to add. And because there's nothing to add, God is not caught by surprise of anything. And it's actually a very deep concept. We spoke about it a little bit last week. It is a deep Kabbalistic concept of God knows, but we still have freedom of choice, etc. But the idea is it's that God is not changed by us, by our good deeds, by our bad deeds. It just doesn't affect a change. So the Alter Rebbe begins today, what we're going to study today, he says, and this is what's written in the Zohar, in the Kabbalah, that there's no place devoid of him. Loi be'ilo'in, v'loi betatoin. Upper worlds, lower worlds. So God himself is to be found in the lower worlds and in the physical world. And he says another place in Zohar, it says that God grasps all, but none can grasp him. God encompasses all worlds, and no one goes out from his domain. And the third thing is, God permeates all worlds. He binds and unites a kind to its kind, upper and lower. And there is no closeness in the four elements, of which the four worlds, excuse me, sneezing on the truth. Thank you. Sorry about that. There is no closeness in the four elements, of which this corporeal world is comprised, except through Hashem, except through the Holy One, blessed be He. And that's what it says, excuse me, in the Zohar, right? So now, he's going to explain these three things. Nobody can grasp him. God encompasses the world, and God permeates the world. So there's three things that we're going to talk about today. And he says, so now the Alter Rebbe is explaining the Kabbalah. He says, no one can grasp him, means that there's nobody out there who can even grasp by means of his intellect. The smartest person, superior intellect, whatever it may be, the essence and being of God. So there's no corporeal creature in the higher worlds, in the lower worlds. If it's a creation, then it cannot grasp it. Right? God, it's just the less machshava tefisa beklei, and no thought can grasp you at all, as it says. So God, what he's saying here is God cannot be grasped, even by the heavenly thought process, right? So it's even the upper worlds, there's nothing can grasp God, nothing except for God, obviously. Also, grasp means that you can't grasp something and make change. When a person has an experience in the world, or when a person create something, when you become a parent. Yesterday was Father's Day. So when you become a parent, it changes you. It grasps you, parenthood, right? So he's saying nothing. So, and when we make something, we have, they made the first computer. So I'm sure that the makers of the computer, with Michael Dell and Bill Gates, etc. I'm sure it was just such an awesome thing. They would change forever. But what he's saying is that no, nothing can grasp God. So that's the first thing. So grasping is from intellectual point of view, grasping from a change point of view. The upper worlds, lower worlds, nothing can grasp it. The second thing is, he says that actually it's not by the second thing yet, but we'll get to the second thing in a second. He says, and even in the lower worlds, right? So even though God permeates the world, God fills the world, right? You still can't grasp him. And it's not like a soul in a body. See, the soul in a body is affected by the body, right? So when the body's in pain, the body is weakened, the soul is weakened. If the body's cold, if the body's hot, and if it's too hot, too cold, etc. However, God, there's absolutely no change whatsoever, because God is not grasped within the world and is not graspable. So that's the first thing. The second thing, when he talks about, and this is fundamentals, by the way, fundamental Kabbalah. The second thing is Sovev Kolaman, that God encompasses all the worlds. That doesn't mean, when it says God encompasses, it doesn't mean, God forbid, he's not found in them, right? Remember, we discussed a few days ago, there were some people who made that mistake and said God is sitting on his throne of glory and he's supervising, but he's not there. So he says, no, just because we use the term Sovev, God encompasses, it doesn't mean that he's Sovev at all, right? God forbid. Doesn't mean that, heaven forfend, that God is not found in the world. But he says, think of it this way. When a human being, right, when a person reflects on something, he reflects on an intellectual subject, or he's thinking about the something he has to do, or he's thinking about that he's gotta once and for all change the oil in his car, right? He's thinking about it. So then, because he's thinking about it, his intellect and his thought encompasses the subject. This is his intellect. This is the oil in the car. So he's thinking about it. So his intellect encompasses. But it's not, you can't say it really encompasses. His mind is not stuck in the oil filters. It's just, it encompasses. He's thinking about it. So therefore, his brain is wrapped, his thoughts are wrapped around this particular item. When you say your thoughts are in the, your thoughts are in the gutter. So that means, your thoughts are in the gutter, and you're wrapped around gutter stuff. But he says, so that's a person. That's a human being. A human being, yes, when they think of something, it doesn't mean they're actually there, but it means their thoughts encompass the subject they're thinking about. But God, who, when we say that God's thoughts are not like our thoughts, so he says God's thoughts, God's knowledge of all created being actually encompass every creature and every creation. Because once again, God's knowledge is the life force, and which brings it into existence from nothing. So God, very different than a human being, God's thoughts actually encompass. So it brings about their creation. It brings about their continued existence, right? It doesn't necessarily descend to the level, but it still encompasses them, right? A little tricky, because when we think about us encompassing something, it's physical. So God encompasses creation, all of creation, but it doesn't have to go down to its level. So that's what Sovev means. So Sovev is this lofty energy that brings it into existence, and it everywhere. It encompasses us everywhere, and God, every single moment, it is there encompassing the entire creation. So that's Sovev. So grasping is no one can grasp him intellectually, no change. Sobev is that he actually does encompass, albeit not descend. And then there's another energy. The other energy is called memale. God fills the worlds. And he says that is the life force that's in every single created being. And so, which is contracted to such a great degree. And it depends on the creation. So for a human being, it's contracted 1,000,000 times. For a rock, it could be contracted 1,040,000 times. So every single creation gets its own level of energy, which is contracted in order to create, animate this specific thing. And it allows this mamale, this energy is so contracted that it allows something that's finite to be created, right? Because if it wasn't contracted as much, there's no way it would be a finite creation. God's infinite, and infinite things happen with God. But when you contract it and contract it and contract it, so it's both qualitatively and quantitatively, and because it must vest itself in the finite creative being and unite with it, so therefore it has to be seriously contracted. He says, and just like a sun, right? Example of the sun. So the body of the sun is finite, and it's limited quantitatively. In other words, it's 167 times of the globe of the earth, says the Alter Rebbe. I don't know if scientifically, but the Alter Rebbe says it'll be good to find out that the sun orb, the globe, is a finite measure. It may be huge, but it's a finite measure. It's 167 times the size of the globe of the earth. And its light is also limited. It can only extend so far because it cannot light infinitely because it's a created being. So even something as powerful as the sun, who when we speak of degrees, we can't even fathom how hot it is, it's still finite. Because guess what? However hot the sun is, 1 degree more is more than the sun's capable of. And even if the sun can shine for millions of miles, it can't shine millions of miles and then 1 mile, right? It has its limits. And he says, and so is true with every single created being. Every single created being is gavul b'tachlis, is finite and is limited. And he says that he says, in fact, this whole creation, it says the whole earth, right? It's a journey of 500 years, whatever that means. So in other words, but it's 500 years, not 501 years. So the bottom line is this entire universe is ultimately finite. Vimkain. So if everything in creation is finite, is therefore we have to say the chayas, the life force and the vitality is powerfully contracted because it has to go through multitudes of numerous and powerful contractions until created beings that are finite and limited are brought into existence. So it's, and to do that, to go from the infinite to the finite, it can't just be cause and effect. It would never happen. It has to be powerful and many contractions. And he says, because you think about it. He says, because what is the source of everything? What is the source of life? God, the breath of God's mouth, right? That is enclosed, vested in the 10 utterances. And he says, so God's mouth, God, and God's speech, so to speak, God's revelation, that's what speech means. Speech is a revelation. So God's revelation could technically be infinite. God could speak, as an example, and it just goes on forever. Infinite. Right? And he says, and therefore, to create worlds that are finite and things in the world that are finite if he didn't do it, if he did not contract, he says, then this corporeal world, whose beings are limited and finite, the sun, the world, anything and everything, everything has a shape and a measure and a size, right? That's what it means by limited and finite. It has it's the influence, it's the power, like the sun, the light. Everything is ultimately, even if you have 1 million, gigawatts or whatever it is, it's still not 2 million gigawatts, et cetera, et cetera. So he says, if God did not contract his power, then this world could never have been created. So it was the contraction of God's life force that made possible the creation of this physical, limited world with its finite creation. Because as we explained earlier, he says in parentheses here, as he says earlier, so just like God is called Ein Sof, without end, infinite, so too God's causations, God's attributes are also infinite. So in other words, the vitality that comes from God's attributes, kindness, severity, splendor, victory, humility, etc., Malchus, he says, are all infinite. So because they're all part of God. And God's mouth and God's revelations, once again, because it says, God said, let it be. So God is infinite. This world was created with God's chesed, God's kindness, which is infinite. But rather, God contracted himself greatly, that it was able to come from him, and it was able to vest itself in the combination of these 10 utterances, as we discussed. These 10 utterances, you put one word first, another word first, there's the gematria, the numerical value of this letter and that word, and you interchange interchange the letters. An aleph and an ayin could be interchanged. They both have no sound, right? A samach and a sin both have exactly the same sound. A chet and a chaf, right? And the five ways of articulation, right? The larynx, the lips, the teeth, the throat, and the tongue. So by transmuting and flipping around letters, God was able to create the world. So every time God flipped a letter, that's another contraction. So God said, "Let there be light," or so that is a light. But then God took the light, right, which is the numerical value is 107, and God made it in a different way. So there's the sunlight, which is limited, et cetera, et cetera. And every time God did it, and every time God transmuted and intertwined these letters, was another symptom. Was another contraction. I think I said once before is that growing up we had this game is where we had 5 letters or 4 letters, and it said rich, for example, and then 7 columns down it said poor, and you had to change to get from rich to poor by changing 1 letter each time, only 1 letter. And so you do the rich, then you do and it has to make sense. So I don't know if that particular example is a good one. So rich, and then you had to use another change 1 letter. Each time you change a letter, you were further away from rich and closer to poor. So too, each time God changed a letter, you were further away from its source, and you were closer to a finite world, until eventually, truly, a finite world was created. And in these letters that were transmuted and the gematria and flipped, etc., he says ultimately they can trace their source to infinity. But the way God set it up is that he did it in such a way that they were able to create a finite corporeal material, physical world, which is finite. Tomorrow we'll talk more about the symptom. In fact, we'll probably be talking about symptom for a while, but that's it for today. Any questions? All right. God bless.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.